Chair, and what a great start to the morning. Very great insight from Lisa, and I'm really pleased to be here today. Just want to quickly clarify it. I'd love everybody to follow the podcast. It's Women Talk Tech. You can find us on iTunes. You can find us on Spotify. And womentalktech.info is our website where you can listen to the podcast. But I'm not here to talk about that today. I'm here to talk about a very passionate subject for me, which is AI. And I think we're at a critical point in AI, and we have an incredible panel this morning who's going to share their insights on this. And I want to take a minute and introduce the panel because each of them in their own right has a lot of expertise and incredible insights into this topic. And we sort of, as we were talking about the session before we were getting going and getting to know each other as a discussion group, I learned bit about each one of the people on the panel today, and I think it's important. I'd like first about Irene Wadowski Berger, and he has a very seasoned background as an IBM researcher, but he's currently with MIT, associated with MIT, and a fellow of the MIT Research Center. And he is specifically talking about the impact of technology on the economy and technology in our lives and the impact of AI on our lives. And so I'm excited to hear some of Irene's notes, and I'm going to let each speaker have some opening comments once I introduce everyone. The next person on our panel this morning is that I'd like to introduce is Lisa Woodley. And here's what I think is interesting about Lisa. She came right out in our group discussion and said, I am not a technologist. And so often we hear people say, you know, I'm either a tech person, I'm not a tech person, here's what I do. And so I love what Lisa brings to the table. And what Lisa does bring to the table is a degree in psychology and philosophy. And she is studying the impact of AI on people. And I think that that's something that we all want to understand. And I've got a few probably pretty tough questions for the group this morning, and I think we're gonna get to it. But she's currently working and is an adjunct professor in human-centric approach to learning at Rutgers. She's a science fiction fan, which I think serves her well, and she is going to talk to us about why a healthy fear of what AI is important, but we need to look on the positive side. So Lisa, welcome to the panel this morning. The next person I'd like to introduce is Radia Funa. And Radia, you have a very interesting background. You are a lawyer in Washington, D.C. You were a lawyer, I think, and you're now in New Jersey, and you are very involved in law and compliance and a legal background, but that hasn't been what's driven you in your career so far. You've got an unbelievable roster of things that you've done, including working with the World Economic Forum, Fortune 500 companies, and you currently have your own business where you're looking at the human evolution of smart machines. AI versus humans is a very hot topic for you, and you're consulting on this topic. And so you bring a very interesting approach and a very interesting background. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Tasha Jones. And Tasha, where have I lost my notes on Tasha? Sorry, Tasha is got, again, unbelievable background. Used to be in the US military and intelligence. I'd love to know some of the stories you know, but she was part of the federal defense sector in the US government. And she's now very involved in understanding how data should be used in decision making. And she's used a word in our previous session that when we were talking that I want to bring up, because this is an important word for me, and it's called bias. And particularly as we have this AI conversation, the idea of data being biased, the idea of programming being biased, is really important, and the impact that that's going to have on demographics going forward. And she's got some very interesting examples that she wants to share. She's currently consulting on this topic. So again, yet another interesting background and variation. So with all that being said, welcome to our panel this morning. And I'd like to start with Irving, if I could. If you could maybe just give us your opening thoughts on AI, and then we'll move to each person. But give us your thoughts on AI versus human, good or bad.
Thank you, Marie. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I've actually been involved in AI for quite a while. My first management job at IBM's research labs was managing a small group working on AI back in the days before quite a number of you were not born, 1974, 75. And here I am 45 years later, and I'm affiliated with MIT, which has been doing quite a bit with AI. And we launched a new College of Computing last year, which is dedicated to lots and lots of things about the impact of AI, or having a conference in November on AI on the future of work, and so on. So Marie, you asked me, what do I think of AI? Well, look, in the end, AI is just a technology, and humans have been co-evolving with our technologies for hundreds of thousands of years. We shape our technologies, and in turn, the technologies shape us. But the reality is that, like no other technology, AI captures our imagination. Part of it is the wonder of all the things we attribute to AI. Quite a few of them from science fiction movies, Blade Runner, where we are not even sure if the Harrison Ford character is a human or a robot, or TV series like Westworld, which are full of these humans and these robots, and nobody can tell quite the difference. That's one part of it. Then we have the fear, which is the Terminator. Will these robots come and try to take over? Or will we come to the singularity, which was supposed to be the time when AI becomes so powerful that the machines take over and exponentially become far more intelligent than we are. So where do I stand in all that? It's a wonderful technology. It can do incredible things. I was in IBM when the Blue defeated Garry Kasparov in chess, one of the major challenges of AI in '98. A few years ago, AlphaGo, a supercomputer from Google, defeated the world's Go champion, a very complicated game. AI can do translation, AI can recognize natural language, it can do lots and lots of things, but it's just a goddamn technology. It may be more general purpose than an airplane or a car or electricity, but it's a technology. But it's a very powerful technology.
Okay, so I'm going to put you down on the pro side. I'm going to say you're pro, and you're saying it's just a technology. It could do a lot of things for us, but it's just a technology.
And let me give you a caveat. Like any other very powerful technology, we need to be very careful. Electricity is really, really useful, but I wouldn't recommend you touch a power box of 440 volts because it can kill you. And if we don't do the right things with AI, then bad things can happen for sure.
So I'm going to put you down. I'm going to qualify that. I'm going to put you down for good, but with caution. All right. So we'll come back to that. Thank you, Irving. Lisa, what's your take?
Yeah. It's not going to be entirely different than Irving from where you're going to end up at the end. But, so the one thing I should say, I don't consider myself a technologist, but what's funny is I work for a technology company. So I'm vice president of CX for NTT Data Services. And, the company that I work for is really about technology innovation and pushing the edge. But my job is to bring that human-centric philosophical perspective in to recognize it's a technology, and what we do with it is going to make all of the difference in the world. And one of the reasons I'm really excited to be talking about this topic today is because I like so many inventions. Irving had mentioned electricity, but like so many inventions throughout history, AI has as much potential for good as evil. I mean, if you think about gunpowder and the splitting of the atom and all of these things, there is what you do with it is really going to determine whether or not it's good or evil. But what's interesting with AI, what makes it, in my opinion, maybe a little more nefarious, is some of the downsides, like bias, are often hidden from us. And AI is in so many parts of people's lives that people don't realize it, they don't recognize it, they don't know. So in many ways, it's more pervasive and it's much more hidden from us. And so there is a pretty dark side. But having said that, I'm still pro AI. But with a big, maybe a slightly bigger caveat than Irving, I'm not sure. We can't, we can't just leave it to the technologists. No offense to the technologists, but we have to include designers, psychologists, ethicists into the mix. And the thing we really need to be asking is not what can we do, because technologists tend to do that. I'm married to an engineer who is always thinking about what's possible. And I'm like, no, what should you do, right? And think about what if we succeed? Because if we succeed, what's going to happen if that AI does exactly what you told it to? So imagine AI is a genie that has granted you a wish. And if you have read any stories like that, right? If you're not really, no matter how carefully you word it, the genie gives you exactly what you asked for. And that's when you get into trouble. And so we need to start thinking of AIs as that genie. And what I love about this panel, and it was great, Marie, when you were going through and introducing it, this interdisciplinary diverse perspective that we have right here in this panel, this is what we need to keep AI, to keep me pro AI, is we need these kinds of perspectives coming together.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Lisa. Radia, over to you.
I love the genie example. Like, Lisa, I'm going to steal that. I'm going to talk about a genie till the cows come home. I think it's so easy.
It's important. Yeah.
I am, it's funny because I'm neither for or against AI. I'm a futurist. I'm a business coach. I primarily work in the US, but I do work in global forums like the United Nations, like World Economic Forum. And when I founded Build and Blaze, it was because I was looking at 21st century technologies against strategy, because I was working with Fortune 1000 companies at Heidrick and Struggles. So it's very interesting to me. For the last 8 years, I've led the firm's technology and transformation projects. I've worked with clients still in the Fortune 50, like with Verizon. I've worked with United Nations, all around innovation units. You know, at the UN, they wanted to establish an innovation unit in a 70-year-old part of the organization. That was, you know, kind of one of the things that Irving was saying earlier is, you know, I've been doing this for quite a while. It's interesting because in that space, it was super bureaucratic. The whole point was, why do we need to know about these technologies? What do they matter when you're looking at kind of these big ideas? And so how do you interject, if you will, making them understand that in the 21st century, this is not an et cetera. It is actually a critical thing that is impacting their stakeholders around the world. But I think primarily my work as a theorist, especially my theory on human-machine coevolution, has really impacted my interest in AI. I also advocate technology and as an accelerator of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN. So that also drives my interest. But I would say from an AI perspective, as a strategist, I remain technology agnostic. So, and I do that by design, especially as I work on transformation projects, because I want to be able to be on the side of the business. And the side of the business may or may not be on the side of the technology. So what works best for the business? Lisa said it perfectly when she said that you've also got to think about what if you succeed. You know, when we're at Verizon and they say we want to bring in blockchain, for example, you know, not to step away from AI for a second, but they want to bring in blockchain. What if you succeed in integrating blockchain in this system, in this process? Is that better for the organization strategy? Is that better for your consumers? And then as a theorist, I live in the research world, right? So I live kind of in the future. I don't have to be real, if you will, as I do on the strategy side, which keeps me grounded. So with my theory of human-machine coevolution that was released in 2017, I believe AI is a member of this generation of transformative technologies that over the past 50 years or so have been changing us in unprecedented ways, down to our human behavioral code. So that's the other kind of, if it was a coin, that's the flip side for me. But in essence, for me, it's about knowledge. It's about context. It's about seeking understanding. What does AI mean to you? What does it mean to your personal and your professional life? You know, so for example, a lot of us in the audience may not work with AI at our job. So this does not seem like it impacts us directly. But we don't realize just how much AI we use in our smart home technologies, for example, in our iPhones or our, our Android phones, how much of it do we use and how does it impact? And then what role do we play? How do we participate?
Okay, so Reddy, I'm going to put you down for neutral. You're going to be our person dead in the center, and we'll come back to you on this in a second. And I do agree with you on understanding. Okay, so first of all, I've always said, yeah, we've let the genie out of the bottle, and there's no stuffing the genie back in. And our next person that we're going to hear from, Tasha, I'm sure you've seen the flip side of this in your day-to-day now and your previous work in the military. And so we've let the genie out of the bottle. And I think as we get going in our discussions, I want to talk about how we participate as individuals in the broader conversation around what this may or may not mean to us and how it impacts us and bias. Tasha, what side are you sitting on here?
Well, I think I'm a cross between basically all the speakers that have already talked so far, which is pretty interesting. My experience and knowledge with AI is heavily grounded in the identification, collection, analysis, and curation of data for AI efforts, and primarily in like the US federal and defense markets is where I grew up. And so my perspective when we're talking about artificial intelligence is heavily influenced by those things. I believe that, the current AI landscape is bursting with potential. There's been so many breakthroughs, especially in the field of machine learning. I also believe the integration of process automation, analytics, and various complex machine learning efforts, integrating all of those different things is accelerating and transforming how we work, how we live, how we socialize and communicate with each other. There's a lot of changes that are happening with the intersection of these various technologies. And because of that, and because of those different intersections, as well as with the exponential increase in the Internet of Things, where we have connectedness of everything for the most part, your refrigerator, your air conditioner, your car, your garage. Everything is connected together. And with that explosion in parallel computing power, we got the prevalence of dynamic, storage capabilities. I believe, and I know this is probably controversial, but I do believe that the future of AI with that interconnectedness and integration of other technologies has the potential to be limitless. However, realizing the extremes of that word limitless, I think is a very, 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 very long way off. Just like what Irving said, there's still these movies that we see, one that I really enjoy, Ex Machina, where, she goes to take over and everything. And like that's not going to happen anytime soon, but we have to acknowledge and see how the transitions in this type of technology is impacting us from a job perspective. Trucking industry is one that's always called to bear up first because of automation with driverless vehicles. And there's so many others that are being significantly impacted by artificial intelligence. So I'm pro technology. However, in my role as being a solutionist and providing strategy, I am agnostic to the technology. I'm focused on more of addressing how the solution should align and fit for the customer or the business at hand. And there's many options that fall within the spectrum of AI. but I put a big emphasis on the data component. And that is where I would consider more of my expertise and knowledge, because a lot of people are not as data literate as they should be. And that'll be something that I'll be pushing for, understanding data and how your information, even in its most limited form, when it's commingled with other data points about you, has a exponential impact to how you're treated, from loans to insurance and so on. So, and how that data potential bias in data can impact different systems that exist across our military, our healthcare, and finance systems. That's something that I do think is of most concern, and something we need to stay engaged in.
Marie, can I make a small comment? Tasha mentioned Ex Machina. It's fascinating that when you see a movie like Ex Machina or a series like Westworld, the robots look like these beautiful women. If you look at robots in the real world, they look like goddamn machines. And the reason is, what the hell would a robot that looks like a beautiful woman be doing in a manufacturing line helping to build cars? So that's one of the things that are so interesting about AI. We ascribe them human qualities, whereas in fact their gigantic promise is as useful technologies, useful machines. Sorry, Tasha.
So let's just come back to something Tasha was saying. I've been in the discussion we started to have about AI, specifically about ethics. And I want to talk about ethics because it's something we don't all agree on, and bringing ethics to bear when it comes to deciding what we apply AI to and what we don't. Radhi, I see you shaking your head. Can I get you to kick off this question around ethics, and how do we bring ethics to bear with respect to AI?
Oh, yes, I was shaking my head, Marie, because I love this question. I think that is probably the most critical element of a lot of these new technologies, but AI specifically, given that AI is kind of this core that sits in technologies that you don't even know it exists, and you don't realize they're being powered by AI. As a UN advisor specifically, and I work in, as I said, these various global forums, my answer to how you integrate or how you think about ethics is twofold. Firstly, regulations play a very important role. And yet we have to remember not to over-regulate, because that then gets in the way of innovation. And how does humanity move forward without innovation? Because we've been innovating since fire. And it was fire that created all of this. I mean, where would we be without fire, right? Where would our brains be? Would they really be this big? Likely not. There is indeed some agreement on ethics. So when you think about, do we all agree on ethics? Not specifically, but there is some agreement simply because there are forums like the UN where 193 countries are members, and they have sat together, they have participated on definitions of ethical concepts like, human rights, for example, right? The human rights include women. It took a while to make the decision that women's rights were human rights because women were also humans. And that happened at the UN. So just as they did then, they are doing this now. So for this particular topic, there are conversations underway in forums like the UN, like World Economic Forum, on guiding especially heads of state, but also heads of organizations, governments, but also individual stakeholders on how we develop policy for AI. Given how relatively new and fast moving the technology is, it is an exponential technology, how relatively new and fast moving the frontier is, of course, we notice that policy is struggling to keep up. So when I first went to the UN to second there as head of innovation in 2016, one of my immediate roles was to advocate the Sustainable Development Goals at what we called innovation clusters. So something like Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley or Silicon Waj or Silicon Roundabout in London. It was my job to go around and tell these organizations within these clusters just how much the UN needs them to begin to understand where the stakeholders in the 21st century are going. And so for me, I saw the frustration at that point because the technology is moving so much faster than the policy that it feels like we can't get our policy leaders to understand.
Lisa, I want to hear from you on this subject because I know we've had a pretty robust conversation around how are we going to, not just as individuals, but organizations, think about ethics surrounding AI moving forward. And you had some good suggestions for people.
Yeah, well, so I mean, first of all, I love what Radia said around how it's being addressed, that I'm actually now personally connected with somebody who is a part of seeing that that's happening at places like the UN, because a lot of times what happens in popular culture is people confuse ethics and morality, right? And there's a difference. Morality is that sort of gut feeling that you have about right and wrong. Ethics is something that is contextual and it's not subjective, but it's not subjective because we've defined the ethics. And then it becomes the question of who is defining the ethics and how are they defining the ethics? And so it's good to hear, what's happening. One of the other risks, so when you think about it contextually, if you don't contextualize the ethics that you're coming up, whether it's there might be some universals, right? But you've got to look by industry and by what you're trying to do with the AI, for example, or you're going to end up with something watered down, not to call out Google, but you're going to end up with that, like, do no harm, don't be evil.
Yeah.
And that's not useful, right? To just say, don't be evil, because then you start to get into morality and like my idea of evil was different than your idea of evil. So,
Yes.
So we really need to come together and agree on those things. There was another thing I saw this week. So NTT Data just released a study that we did with Oxford Economics, something that didn't occur to me for businesses until we found it in this study. 42% of executives that we surveyed have conducted customer research to get their opinions on ethics and technology. So now suddenly we need governments and leaders to come together to agree what the ethics are. But companies are now going to have to start to think about what is the perception of ethics that our customers are having. And so, So we really need to open this dialogue to have it not, again, it's back to interdisciplinary, not to be just technologists, not to be just leaders. We all need to talk about it. But I mean, I will say, this is the thing that worries me the most. I think regulation, you're right, not too regulation, but we're still arguing over the definition of AI. So I sometimes wonder if we can't even agree on what AI is, it becomes challenging. And so one of the things that I look to is whether it's AI and we agree on it or not, let's start talking in context of risk. Let's think about with technologies, what are the risks that we want to avoid? And then backing up from the risks is where your ethics can come from, because then you can start to more contextualize, that is what we all agree we want to avoid this. Now let's step back and talk about what does avoiding that look like? What do the rules look like that are more contextual and specific than don't be evil?
Very good. Yeah. Okay. We only have a minute left, and I think we're going to open it up to questions. So I'm going to do a bit of a lightning round with each one of you, and I just want you to give me, one answer off the top of your head, especially people who are participating in the summit today, who are thinking about where their next job might be, where their next career might be. Where's the future AI talent pool going to come from? Let's go to you first, Tasha. Quick answer. Where's the future talent pool going to come from?
I would say heavily from third party, in the more immediate term, third party organizations that are supporting kids being introduced to artificial intelligence and coding and companies and things like that. I believe that's going to be a significant area where we get our next batch of contributors.
Irving, you're in the university system. Where do you think they're going to come from?
It depends what you want to do. If you want to develop algorithms, then you probably need a lot of advanced education. If you want to be involved in applications that use these technologies, which is the vast majority, then that's everybody. That would be like asking, should everybody know how to use the internet? The answer is yes. And everybody, when it comes to the applications, should be very comfortable with data-driven applications, which is in the end what AI is all about.
Okay, all right. Radia, quickly, where do you think the future talent pool is going to come from?
I think public and private partnerships to develop education and research and development initiatives that help close the gap that we have today.
Okay, good observations. Our first question up, now we're going to move into a question round from our audience. What does the future look like for managing digital employees when our offices are both human and robots in a sense? And I guess when you say robots, we've got, you know, our laptops that are storing data. We've got tools that are monitoring what we're doing, listening to us, using data to serve us up stuff. Tasha, do you want to take that one? What does the future look like for managing digital employees?
It looks very complex, but I think with we've seen with COVID that, you know, people are very resourceful and agile and able to adapt. So I honestly believe that we already have the technologies available to integrate people and technology, robots. And I think most people in most jobs today have already been exposed to that. So I don't believe that that's a huge hurdle, especially today. I do believe that it's as far as the marketplace is concerned, how we work is going through a huge shift. And I don't believe those shifts are temporary. I think they're going to be more permanent. And I think it's only going to become more normal for the traditional norms of how we work in this type of environment. It's going to become more extreme with people segueing from being part of companies and things of that nature. So that's my opinion on that question.
Here's another question I think is perfectly suited for Radia. What industries, as a theorist and a futurist, what industries are adopting and scaling AI the quickest at the moment? Who's out front?
I think I would say, and I think that's a great question. I'm not sure that I would know the answer, but I think it would be the ICT industry, information communication technology industries, because if you look at a lot of our AI technologies, Google, Facebook, you know, all of them are in ICT. It's when we went from using our house phone, right, to using the cell phone. We went from searching remember when we had the Britannicas in our bookshelves? We now do that on Google.
What's that? What is Encyclopedia Britannica? I do not know that thing.
You're not old enough, Marie.
Oh, no, I remember. Okay,
ICT.
Okay, Irving, would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, in the end, AI, and especially the parts of AI that have been advancing the most in the last few years, machine learning means you train the algorithms with huge amounts of data. As Radia said, the technology companies are ahead, but a lot of it is because they have a gigantic amount of data. When Amazon helps you, this is what you should be buying, or when Netflix says, you know, Radia, here is a really good movie for you based on what you like, that's all based on data. Now,
and those, I would have to say, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but we only have a minute left. And I would say that those examples are ones that are friendly. And I know there's a lot of examples out there that are not friendly.
One that is not friendly, which is what the social media companies are doing. If they want to steer you in a certain direction, they use AI in a really nefarious way, trying to see, boy, how can I get Tasha to be friendly with these other people that I
Right.
that are not
Right.
very nice or whatever. And
So,
that's a bad use of AI.
right. Okay. So that just kind of dovetails nicely into this other question that this person has asked. And I'm glad you said that, because I think this is a great lead into this question. It seems that AI accelerated before we had a chance to stop and think about what we want to use it for. Do we have time to do that now? To stop and take stock? Lisa, I want to hear from you on this one. Do we have time to stop? Do we have time to?
Well, so what's funny is yeah, so you're kidding yourself if you think people haven't been thinking about it longer than you probably have. And
Right.
that's how we got into the mess that Irving talked about with social media, because people have been using this for longer than we're aware, which is why I mentioned earlier, it's really around that awareness. But I think our very survival depends on us stopping now and taking stock of where we are. And Irving's example of social media is the perfect example. So it's not too late, but we have to do it, and we have to be serious about doing it, about really now thinking, where is it in our lives? How is it impacting it in our lives? If it has gotten to a point that it shouldn't have gotten to, how do we pull it back? And that's going to be people demanding it and governments requiring it, and it's going to be also some of us giving up maybe some of the convenience that we gave our data away for, because there was some convenient thing that I got for it. So I think we all it's going to be tough medicine to take, but we have to take it.
Well, I think that what you've just said, I totally agree with. And I think that's what's made a lot of people stop and think about things that they just blindly said, yeah, great, let's jump on this and start giving them all my holiday photos. Let's see where that leads us. And I think that, people now are starting, and who knows what the next big thing. And so it brings us to another question that's been raised is, do we think we can regulate this? And we had somebody bring up regulations a few minutes ago, but do we think we can regulate it? And if we do think we can do it, can we do it globally? Is this really something that is something that we could do as a society? Is this where we're going? Rabia, let's hear from you on this first, and then we'll jump over to you, Irving.
In a word, absolutely. I think we can regulate this. I think it mostly depends on stakeholder will, right? Human will, but also the will of our heads of state, et cetera. And again, like I said, at the UN, we have regulated elements of our society to prevent war. Remember, the UN was created so that we wouldn't have a World War III. Right? And we have done everything from that to going into children's rights and people's rights and all of that. What makes this so much more difficult than nuclear warheads? It is because we personally have the power over it. We everyday people, in the past, we weren't as involved. And I think that takes you back to what Lisa is saying, which is it's also about what we are willing to give up, what we are willing to understand about our own role. But I think if we demand it, and if we can get the right heads of state as a result of our demands, remember, in a lot of our member states, we vote, right? I think it can absolutely, especially given organizations like the United Nations, World Economic Forum, et cetera, and schools like MIT, what Irving is connected to, and Stanford University, Singularity University. There are a lot of organizations that are working towards that same goal. I think we can link hands and do that together.
Irving, would you agree with that?
Totally. I think that if you look at the history of technology, once it becomes a major part of society, of course you have to regulate it. We've done that with cars. If somebody says, I want to drive without a driver's license, we would say, look, I don't know, join the militia in Idaho. Maybe you can do that there, but you cannot do that in general. Many of us feel that way about running around with automatic weapons. People say, no, if you're in Michigan, you can go to the governor's mansion and show your weapons. In New York, you cannot do that. You absolutely cannot do that. AI is like that. It's a very powerful technology, and we have to make sure that the right things happen. And as Lisa kept saying, and the people who do the regulation are not necessarily the technologists who create the technologies, but it becomes now all of society has to participate.
So we're just about to wrap, and I'm the panelist, so I get the closing word on this. Now, I'm supposed to guide the conversation, but I do want to say this, and it's based on everything I think each one of you have said today and how you've summed it up. I think we're on the verge of some very interesting innovations and breakthroughs in AI, and I think it has the power to do tremendous good. But I think what we have to remember as human beings, that it also has the power to do tremendous harm if we let it. And as human beings, we have to continually look for the decency in everyone and everything, and stand up when we feel that something is not right, and when it feels like it should be going in a different direction. And I think, to your point, it's no different than anything else we've had to put our voice against, whether it was gun control or car insurance, because cars were prevalent on the roads, how we handle things. Technology will continue to be a driving force. There is never going to be a time to put the genie back in the bottle. And I think what's really important is that we continue these types of conversations about it, because I think there's so much more education that needs to be done. And there's so much more understanding that needs to go on around how we move forward with this. Would I get agreement with the panel on that?
Yes.
Yep, absolutely.
Very well said.
Yeah. Okay.
Good
All
summary.
right. Cher, I'm going to turn it back to you. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on this discussion, but I'm going to turn it back to you to lead us into the next section.